most of what I'm talking about today, and really in a lot of webinars, I firmly believe, and I'm sincerely confident that you all already know this stuff. And so in a way, I'm trying to be, somewhat humbling, because I'm not necessarily teaching anything brand new. This isn't, a foreign language. Although some of you probably know multiple languages. I don't. It's impressive if you do. But the point I'm trying to make is that you all already know this. And I think you have to go into this not with, being cocky or anything, but having understanding that inherently as storytellers, we understand these things that I'm going to be covering. What I'm trying to do is put them in an organized way and approach so that you can then do what you will with it, to be reminded, basically, is what I'm trying to say. Let's just get started. So like I said, as you know, I teach this 12 sequence approach, and specifically if a feature length story with those 12 sequences, of course, like I said, episodes of TV, they do follow the same general sequential order of beats and moments. The 12 sequences, though, they're not just basic structure. And I want to reiterate that, it's not just this happens when, it's not paint by numbers. It's actually a very specific character-driven approach to structure that I follow and teach. Other consultants go by an 8-sequence approach, a 10-sequence approach, whatever. Some say there are 7 acts, some say there are 8, whatever works for you. This process of 12 sequences, just in terms of math, makes sense to me. So in past webinars, I've called it emotional structure as opposed to logistical structure. And basically what that means is that every sequence within a story exists in order for your main character or multiple characters to be tested, grow relationships, face up to obstacles, and ultimately evolve and change. Today, I'm going to be diving into the third act, or as the title of the webinar, as I'm sure you all notice, states, your final act. Sounds a little morbid. I probably could have come up with a better title than saying, "His is all your final act." I didn't mean it that way. After, of course, I published it, I realized, But anyway, I think you know what I'm saying. But as a very basic, quick review, a sequence makes up multiple scenes. In a feature, it's about 10 pages, which could make up, 4 to 6 scenes, maybe. In an hour-long episode of TV, it's maybe 5 pages. Again, this is not a hard and fast rule. It's a very relative process depending on your project. For half-hour comedies, it's basically just, the 4 main anchor sequences within a story: sequence 2, 6, 9, and 12. And the scenes that exist to further the multiple character storylines exist with, in between those major anchor sequences, anchor sequences 2, 6, 9, and 12. There are, just as, again, quick review, there are 3 sequences in your first act of a feature, 6 in the second act, 3 in your third act. What I'm going to focus on today is primarily sequences 9 through 12. So it's the end of your second act sequence, sequence 9, and then the 3 sequences in your final act. And again, don't overthink this. I know it sounds like a bunch of information if it's the first time you're hearing this, but we'll just go with it, especially because TV is different in that, that an hour long has 5 acts. The math doesn't perfectly work out in terms of fitting 12 sequences into 5. But like I said, this isn't paint by numbers. The purpose here is for all of us to see beyond the paint by numbers approach and focus on the more important elements of a character-driven story. So we can dive in, but before I do, just a couple things that I want to share really quick. We have some fun things coming up. We've got this free to enter ISA pitch challenge that closes on October 6th. So it's coming up. And here is the link if you want to see. Most of you probably already know about this, but if you don't, you can check that out. That event is going to culminate in writers being chosen through that pitch challenge to pitch to executives on a panel on November 17. So in a way, it's like a pitch contest, if you will, but it's free to enter. And hi, Tony from Santa Monica. But anyway, yeah, November 17. Also, our very own Shayna Weber, who I host a YouTube show called ISA Insider News with. You should check that out. She's interviewing the writer, director, and producers of the Shudder horror film Glorious on October 5th at 5 p.m. Los Angeles time. It's the making of a horror film. So for you genre writers, definitely check that out. It's free. Most of our events, if not all of our events, are free. It's a free education, ladies and gentlemen, and you can interact with everybody on the panel. So those are the 2 things. As always, if you want to work with me one-on-one in a coaching, consulting capacity, read your material, give you notes, build and brainstorm your projects, you can email me at max@thestoryfarm.org. All right, Later on, if you want me to repeat any of that, I'm happy to. But okay, let's just get on to it. So starting from the standpoint, the perspective of the low point. We all know that this is kind of, dark night of the soul kind of thing, but let's not overthink think it too much. It's our sequence 9 of the 12 that I'm talking about. The low point, and I'm starting there on purpose because it's essential in bringing us into the third and final act, because it shows the main character just how much he or she, I'm going to say he, everyone, I apologize for all the people who identify it as she. It's just, this is how it came out as I was writing my notes. But the main character, just how much he actually has to learn, but just not deliberately or obviously. That low point is the failure point. He finds out what he has to learn by failing. And that failure is something that he can't get over. So by the end of that low point, it feels like the end of the movie. It feels like this is the end of the story. He failed. It's over. There's nothing he can do. He doesn't know how to move on because he hasn't learned his real lesson yet. That's the whole point of that 9th sequence existing. So it's basically summarize the third act. We're going to talk about a little bit more of a feature approach here, but this applies to any story. Don't worry about the number third, if that's the number. But so yeah, basically summarize third act of a feature is to say that a character learns what he did wrong and why in sequence 11. In sequence 12, he shows us and himself that he knows what he has to do in order to actually learn the lesson. And it's going to be excruciatingly difficult. It'll be difficult because he's never done it or said it before, because he's never allowed himself to be wholly vulnerable in that particular way. That's the basic summary of a third act. Now, obviously, I'm going to get into more details. That vulnerability, though, and this is key, will be shown in the first act. We're going to get a glimpse of this, and it's such an important note to remember. Everything is connected, obviously, in terms of the sequences and structure. So we show the main character being himself in the first sequence, the beginning of the story, reacting from a flawed place to the world around him. But we can also show one moment that reveals just a tiny bit of his vulnerability in that first sequence in the beginning of the story. But he shuts off, closes up, shuts down, pushes it away. He then, moves on and remains himself, because like I said in previous webinars, I'm sure, change and personal change is really hard, and it's very scary, and it's much easier to not change and to just keep going through the same patterns, believing in the same beliefs, and on and on. So you want to think of the low point of your story, that sequence 9, as your character attempting to achieve the plot goal, of course, but by being his old self, his flawed self, without having even remotely learned his lesson, even after all that he's been through and with whom he's been through it, the relationships. But he fails because he was unwilling to change. And really, in a very big way, the latter half of your feature's story shows the main character actually falling more and more into his flaw. He's doing it in a slightly different way, because of all the obstacles and challenges, especially relationship cracks and breaks that he's experienced in the latter half of the second act. He's going to harden and become a little more extreme in some ways. And his determination to achieve the goal becomes rooted in who he has always been, his flawed self. So that's how we're kind of looking at that second half of the second act, leading us through the 9th sequence, the low point. And in a way, does this sound like real life to you? No, probably. And it's probably because we as writers have a responsibility to present these universal themes and messages and emotions that the audience can relate to, regardless the story or genre that you're writing. It's difficult to change. We don't want to change. And so when things are forced upon us to change, what do? We react in an even more flawed way. Sadly, this is the human nature. Okay, so to get back to some specifics, the beginning of your third act, that's sequence 10 and 11, if we're following that sequential order, is then likely showing one moment in sequence 10, maybe 2, of your character just wallowing in self-pity. It's reverting back to his flaws, but in complete failure mode, give up mode, like I feel sorry for yourself mode. And so this is your sequence 10, and it's maybe a scene. We don't need to stay too long in a character wallowing in self-pity. Sequence 11 is when he sees that he can't live like this anymore. He doesn't know what to do, and he can't be that person anymore, not only because he doesn't want to, but because everything's different now. But again, he's at a loss as to what to do about it. And this is kind of what Joseph Campbell means by return to the old world in a way. You don't have to have the character literally return to his old world. And obviously that's possible. But really, in terms of my interpretation of that, it means he returns to his old ways, his old self. He relives his old ways and flaws, but it just doesn't feel right anymore because of everything he just experienced. He can't live in those flaws anymore. It doesn't work for him anymore because he's changed. He's changed because someone else or multiple other people have changed him. And he's seen his old ways hurt the people he's come to care for. And that's a reference to the low point in sequence 9. He then is reminded of all this, usually by someone else, not always, but in sequence 11. And sequence 11 usually provides some kind of new plan, a new approach from a plot perspective to do something different, usually in a very literal physical sense. Sequence 11 then ends with him having this understanding by way of what I call the bootstraps moment. He's lifted up off the ground, sometimes literally. It's kind of laughable in some of these very structured movies. So he can see things from like a new vantage point, a perspective. And again, this bootstraps moment is usually provided by a secondary lead character. And whether that character is alive or dead, it doesn't matter. Like you look at Luke Skywalker and Obi-Wan. Obi-Wan was literally dead in that sequence 11, but the memory of Obi-Wan and what he taught Luke, and really literally even his voice when, like ghost Obi-Wan comes back and he's saying things, the Force or whatever, it lifts Luke up and reminds him what he's actually fighting for. But here's the thing. He doesn't implement this new plan until the start of sequence 12. These are really just organizational markers. Obviously, in a screenplay, you're not going to mark, okay, end of sequence 11, here's the beginning of sequence 12. This is really organizational markers for you to brainstorm, okay? I just kind of want to make that clear. But he doesn't implement this new plan in sequence 11. It's the beginning of sequence 12 is when the new plan is implemented. That begins the literal preparation for the new plan, getting back together with his relationships in some way, then carrying out his plan as we move through that final sequence of sequence 12. The plan, really, that word is easiest to remember as plot, right? The character or emotion comes from how he's a different person now. And we're seeing him react differently to this new plan and others around him, likely positively, but there's something that has changed in this person, this new way, so to speak. It's still new, this feeling of feeling different and having learned a bit of a lesson, but it's there. He's probably nervous because of the new feeling, not just his need to face up to the main opponent, of which he knows he has to do. He has to do that, whatever that opponent is. And that's going to be the most difficult action of all, right? You've got the plan to carry out whatever the plan might be from a plot perspective. But at the end of that plan, you've got the big boss, like in a video game, and it's one thing to come up with the new plan. Achieving the goal through the new plan, that's going to be really difficult. But what is actually and truly the most difficult is facing up to that main opponent. And that becomes that so-called battle scene element coming into play. And that's technically what I titled that 12th sequence, the battle sequence. And it's a battle both physically and emotionally, because he has to not only achieve some kind of plot objective, which will likely be physically difficult in some way, even in a minor way. But more importantly, it's difficult because the opponent represents that main character's old self, his old ways, fears, and ultimately his vulnerability, at least in some way. So the real battle, yes, is usually with the self, but that opponent represents the self, of which the main character needs to overcome. And so this is kind of why I don't believe in that basic cliche or trope where you hear people say this is a man versus self story. And every time I hear that, I'm like, well, yeah, of course. What does that mean? It's so vague that it doesn't help me as someone you're pitching the project to understand what the story is, but it also doesn't help you in terms of the development of your idea, man versus self. Yeah, of course it is. So all stories are that in some way. The self, in a way, can be represented, by the other person, the other character in the story that gets in that main character's way. And yes, sometimes physically, but ultimately the opponent gets in the way of the main character and either consciously or unconsciously prevents him from overcoming himself, or is trying to prevent him from overcoming himself, his biggest fears and doubts. Now I can hear everybody's thoughts and brains working like, well, what about Castaway and these movies that didn't have a direct character? There are always, I can't think of the word, exceptions. However, the island, in a very real way, was Tom Hanks's character's opponent. He had to overcome that island. And so the island was bringing out what was flawed within Tom Hanks's character. And if you remember, and this was probably one of the lower elements of Castaway, which I love, by the way, but they didn't quite build up Tom Hanks's character quite enough in the beginning of the movie from what I could. Anyway, I still love the movie. But what you learn about him is that he is a by the books, on schedule, by the clock, perfectly organized human being. He's a FedEx, executive, and he doesn't really leave room for the possibility of something being off schedule. And so suddenly he's faced with this need to not only be completely by himself, but face up to nature. And so, yeah, you could say it's man versus nature, but it's really nature representing the main character himself. But then there's also this longing to be with Helen Hunt's character by way of the picture. Wilson comes into play as kind of a secondary, but that just is used as a way to allow Tom Hanks's character's flaws and thoughts to come out because he can have conversations with them. So there are always exceptions. But yeah, battle with self is all genres. It is. There's a battle with self in some way. It's just the situation the character is in represents the self that the character needs to get over. Again, this is really general. Not every single story follows that exactly, but basically it does. And so overcoming that opponent, this is how and why theme is stated in, I wrote this wrong in my notes, how and why theme is stated in your third act is basically what I'm trying to say. It's probably the most important element of your third act. I don't go too much in terms of this lecture into themes and figuring out what themes are. My best advice about theme would be in terms of a statement that you're trying to write out, it's like a development approach or brainstorming approach, or if you're in a meeting with an executive or something and they ask you what the theme is, stay away from the basic tropes, love conquers all. Get specific to the story that you're writing, with a universal reference or representation of a love conquers all. You want to extend that a little bit more. Be specific to the action that we're going to be seeing in your story. And then the theme will just feel a little bit more connected to what the person that you're pitching this to is hearing. Anyway, it's probably the most important element of the third act. It's not the resolution of the plot. The resolution of the plot happens because the main character overcomes the opponent, who, like I said, represents what's going on emotionally inside of the main character. And listen, this doesn't need to be literal. In other words, I'm going to talk about Finding Nemo here a little bit. I know this is an old movie, but I like talking about it because most of us have seen this. If you haven't, what are you waiting for? It's one of my favorite movies. But Pixar does this in just about every movie they create. Disney's the same. Watching those types of movies helps you define the structure and then the why behind the structure, because it's so obvious. And so we can learn from this. But if we look at Finding Nemo, Marlin's entire adventure, everything he experiences is his opponent. And so therefore, every character represents what Marlin is battling with, his inability to let go and ultimately allow his son to be free to grow up, etc. So the story, though, provides primary characters to then represent his innermost flaw and fear, mainly in the form of Dory. But the situations they kind of bounce to and from, are little representations of the types of fears that he has. And it's pretty obvious to notice this, especially if you're looking for it. But, looking at Dory, even though she's not an obvious villain, she is opposing in a lot of ways, simply because of who she is. She's a fish that forgets everything every 10 minutes or less. She's quite literally the opposite of Marlin, because she lets go of everything. So along his journey then, Dory puts Marlin into various situations that what? They test his flaw over and over and over again, until finally he's about to fall into the mouth of a whale. Remember this? He's like hanging on. He's basically going to die. But what does Dory literally say out loud to him as he's hanging on to Dory's fin? She yells at him, "You need to let go." This is the beauty of Disney and Pixar and really animated movies in general, is that they just state the theme, like this is, you need to figure out a way to let go. But what Dory technically means, of course, in the moment is that Marlin needs to let go of her fin and the whale's tongue so that he can fall into his belly and be cast out through the air hole. Because, remember, Dory can speak whale and Marlin never trusted that she could. So there's a trust issue alongside the need to let go. So finally, of course, he's given a moment where he needs to have, complete blind trust. he lets go and he gets blown out of the whale's air hole. He survives. It's almost, in a way, an immediate change in Marlin. At least that's how we as the audience see that. He's actually really happy and like, that was fun. I could do it again. It's that fun response. We have a question here saying, if you don't state theme, is it subtext? Sure, you could argue subtext. Subtext is a whole other topic. But anyway, going back to this. So what's fun is that we see what seems like an immediate change in Marlin, but his journey isn't done, obviously. He eventually finds Nemo, and he has to trust his son's idea about saving the fish caught in the big net. Remember, there's this giant net, in order for Dory to be saved, because she's stuck in the net too. And so it once again becomes very difficult for Marlin to let go and trust Nemo. So we're reminded that he hasn't fully learned his lesson. And in a way, Nemo represents the biggest opposing force in his life, even though he's not a villain or really even an opponent. He's just opposing because of what's going on inside of Marlin. So where was I? Trust Nemo. So where are we at? Reminded that he hasn't fully learned his lesson, but because of his experiences with Dory and knowing that Dory saved him, he allows himself to let go and trust Nemo. And he even tells all the fish in the net to not give up and to what? What does he say? He says, just keep swimming, to swim down. And so it shows Marlin's learned something. He's learned something so much that he becomes the voice for all of the fish, like the leader who keeps chanting, keep swimming in order to save everybody, in spite of how dangerous this really is. So he's evolved far beyond who he was in the beginning of the story. And if there's anything you remember from this lecture, it's that. Who's the character in the beginning? Who is he or she in the end? Compare the two. And it's up to you how far you want to go in terms of the character arc. It doesn't always have to be a 180-degree change. When Harry Met Sally, I mentioned that movie all the time, but Harry's basically the same guy at the end of that movie. He's just allowed himself to be vulnerable. He's opened himself up a little bit. Anyway, with that, so we see Marlin, he's evolved far beyond who he was in the beginning of the story. What's really fun about the story choice that Pixar made was that Nemo's actually hurt in that big battle scene, and the fish, they fall on top of him before swimming away. So this brings out Marlin's deepest, darkest fear. It's presented right in front of him. Losing his son entirely is his biggest fear. So Marlin's faced with that fear in spite of achieving his goal of finding Nemo and in spite of rescuing all the fish. But it turns out, of course, Nemo's okay. Nemo's proud of his dad, that everything's going to be, better from now on. So the story isn't really about finding Nemo. It's about finding Marlin. So again, this is not, revelatory that I'm speaking here. You all understand this inherently. We just have to know what to look for so that we can then apply it to what we're doing. So in terms of TV, it's somewhat the same, only the end of an episode usually sets up more of an emotional problem for the main character in the form of a new plot problem, or the continuation of a bigger problem on top of the previous plot problem that was set up in the beginning of the episode. That makes sense, doesn't it? It sounded like a puzzle. I'll say that again. So TV is I don't want to say basically the same, because obviously that final act is not the same. It's not a full course correction. We don't see the character correct their flaws. Otherwise, that's the end of the series. But the end of the episode obviously sets up more problems. But we have to remember that it's not just plot problems. It's an emotional problem that is extended and further complicated, but usually because of the plot situation the character is in. And so in TV, you have that much more of an obvious connection between plot and character. Movies, you have more time to kind of separate the two, and I mean, I'm even within the Finding Nemo example, you have that plot situation that Marlin is in of the fish and they need to be freed, Nemo's hurt. It's not that much different, but it's just have a little bit more time to see it all. But so I'll say that again so everybody can hear it. So we've got more of an emotional problem for the main character in the form of a new plot problem that's presented, or we have the continuation of a bigger problem on top of the previous plot problem that was set up in the beginning of the episode. That's key, obviously. It's every episode of TV is virtually the same. We've got the episodic situation, meaning that episode's problem presented in the beginning of the episode, or it's the continuation from the previous episode, same problem, but there's something new that's been added to it. If in a TV episode, a new problem is presented without the audience understanding the emotional complication that comes with it, and you all already know this, either, we're literally seeing it or just assuming whatever that problem is. But then the climax of that fifth act of an hour-long episode is going to be kind of boring, or at least not as exciting as it could be, because it's all just a plot problem. And we don't really see the connection of the true, inner issue that the character has to deal with. And you could say the same in reverse, in other words, if it's only character motivated in terms of the new problem, and it doesn't have an effect on the ongoing plot, then it'll just feel kind of flat or uninspired. And sadly, and I was really excited about this show when I heard it was coming out, but A League of Their Own kind of does this, in my opinion. Kind of that example. They just continually went along the lines of character and emotional problems, which were interesting, and it still kept me watching because I just, I love the time period and all the other non-writing reasons for watching the show. But the concept is actually really plot driven. The concept is straightforward: an all-women baseball league in the 40s World War II era. I want to see that. And they didn't really focus that much on the baseball. And the women fighting to be the best in terms of the sport itself. And that was one reason why I loved the movie so much. They had a nice balance of character, emotional issues and problems matched with the, overall conceptual situation, I guess you could call it, of this all women's baseball league. But by focusing the end of the episodes on character, emotional storyline problems and complications without any real focus on the plot and conceptual hook, you find yourself losing interest a little bit. And as a very different example, White Lotus can do those major character complications without a big plot twist, because the plot itself is really pretty small and low concept. It's just a few groups of really privileged, entitled people trying to enjoy a vacation at a Hawaii resort. So a lot of the so-called plot for White Lotus is very character focused. It was just what the characters were doing and wanting while simply trying to enjoy their vacation. So that's a very low concept, plot oriented show, very character driven. So even White Lotus, they connect those plot problems, but they're connected more directly through the character problem. And it, like I said, it's just a smaller concept overall. So I mentioned the 6th week of my online course. It's not about the victory. This is a little quote that I have. And obviously what I mean by that is that it isn't about Frodo throwing the ring into the volcano. That was cool, and it's what they set out to do. But the third act of that story overall was really about Sam helping his friend believe, and for Gollum to show Frodo just how broken he'd become because of the disease that is the ring. So Sam was Frodo's shining light because he had to be. He had to allow Frodo to see that too. It's all the same. He's the same. He needed to bring Frodo into that light. So it isn't about the victory over Sauron. It's about the evolution into just someone better, stronger, more emotionally evolved. And, story in general, again, you all know this, is about growing up and maturing and being more than who you were the day before. And that's ultimately the victory. That's our final act. That's our third act of a feature. In TV, it's a continuation of a reminder of that need for that character to eventually get to that place, learn something about themselves that they never knew or understood before. And it's one reason why TV is so popular, because we can spend that much time with that character to see that journey, the ups and downs of learning something and then reverting back to flaw and then becoming better and then being worse, even though TV doesn't present all of that character correction, like I said, at the end of every episode, they do, the good shows anyway, show glimpses into just how difficult it will be for this flawed character to change. And the plot problems, situations, the complications that are presented at the end of the episodes are directly tied to some kind of deeper issue, wound, as Jen Grisanti says, a belief system that the main character has always been dealing with. And so that may not correct the wound or flaw at the end of the episode, but the audience is reminded of it. And they're reminded that this problem is a big problem because this type of character who is experiencing it. Obviously, TV is a much different animal because it usually offers multiple storylines with multiple characters acting in a way as their own main character in their own story. So you have a lot more work to do in TV. You have to see all of those through lines, how they're going to end. I just read that the producers and showrunners of Rings of Power, they have 5 seasons played out in terms of developed, and they know exactly what's going to happen, when, where, and why. They even know what the final image of the season series is going to be. You've got to see all of that. Even if you're not going to be the showrunner on your show, you still have to be able to plan all of that, because you're going to be placed with those questions. If you're in a pitch meeting, if you expect to sell your project, you've got to get all of this worked out. Understanding how the final act of each episode can then propel the viewer or the reader, in your case, that's essential. It's a connection between plot and character. Again, you already know this. So, it's an art to tie in all of those storylines throughout a season, or more of the series. But ultimately, TV does follow that same general structure. Your final act of your TV episode begins just after the main character experiences some kind of failure. Their pursuit fails in some way. Then they need to rally those troops, has some kind of a bootstraps moment to go about their pursuit in a different way. And so you could also look at the final act from the perspective of an entire season. If you really want to plan all of your series out, in other words, if you have 12 episodes in a season, that usually means episode 10 is likely the big low point episode. And if you look at like the second or third to last episode of every season from of Game of Thrones, that second or third to last episode was always the best one, because we saw the villains and opponents winning in some way. Like, oh my gosh, our heroes are going to die or something. I mean, we literally saw a zombie dragon at the end of the third to last episode of the final season of Game of Thrones. I mean, how cool was that? And you see, okay, they're going to have to deal with that. Now, what are they going to do? So you have a direct connection to a plot complication, which is purely plot. The dragon turned into a zombie. But we have the memory of all the characters that we're rooting for that we know are going to have to deal with the zombie dragon. So I could go on and on, but these are all very general guidelines. Not every single TV series follows this exact structure, but I'd be willing to put money on it that most of them do in some way. When you're watching your favorite shows, pay attention to the sequential order of the episode of it, in and of itself, and then consider what episode number you're on within the overall season. Then consider how the season itself plays out like a long form feature story, playing very closely with that 12 sequence approach overall. And again, like I say in the 6th week of my coursework, this is an extremely personal process that the character goes through, and you, the writer, you need to fall into just how personal that process is for the character. And long before you start writing a page, you can use your intended emotional ending of your story, meaning the character's flaw when you're developing this. Now you need to figure out what the opposite of that flaw would be, and who, in terms of another character, might represent that flaw in the story. Then consider what the character might have to physically do to show that he or she has changed. And that change it absolutely must be difficult for the main character to experience. And again, as a little reminder here, that this is a personal process for the character, but it's just as personal for you as the writer. If you're not moved by what happens in the end of your story, no one is going to be. So the best way to consider just, how moved you are, if you want to say it that way, and how moved the audience will be, dig into the deep emotional workings of your character, force that character to face up to what the character is the most afraid of over and over and over again. And not all stories, are straightforward, like I said, as a Disney Pixar movie, but it's so helpful to be able to see the general traditional stories and study them. This is why it's so important to go back and study, classic literature. What were the masters doing long before us? Learn from that so that you can take from the general structural approach, add layers, subtlety, subtext, as someone was mentioning, and then your own personal spin to it and on it. So I saw a lot of comments coming through here. Obviously, I wasn't able to get to all of them, but hopefully I guess I did go a decent amount of time there. That final act, it's tricky when you're trying to compare the TV versus feature, because you all know that in a feature, it's the end of your movie. Don't just rely on, well, I've got a sequel or two that I can write, that I have finished, so I'm going to continue the story there. Nobody's really all that concerned with the sequel of a movie that has yet to be made. Make the first one first, finish that off, correct, get that character in a place where you understand the emotional resonance of what that character experienced, meaning you, the writer, and then you, the audience. If there's a sequel, fine. But you want to finish off the story in your feature. In an episode of TV, you want that end of your pilot to really feel like, whoa, look at all the situations that could come from this one or two problems that I'm presented at the end of the episode, because of the connection that the character has emotionally with the story and the situation. All right. Let's see what we got for questions. Jason is saying hello from in Portland, just got back from LA. I'm jealous. I do miss Los Angeles. My sister lives in Portland. I should probably go visit her more often. How many pages should a sitcom episode be? Really good question. And please remember that there is no hard and fast rule. For a sitcom, however, there kind of is. For a traditional network sitcom, you're not going to be going any more than 28 pages. Things could be a little different, but I would say maximum 30 pages. I would keep it at 28. And format is a little bit different too, but that's a traditional network, like an NBC sitcom. You're under 30 pages, mainly because they have to break for commercials. And so really what you're watching is actually like a 20-minute episode of TV. For a half-hour comedy that exists on streamers, you can get away with 34, 35, maybe 36, 7. That just feels long. I've seen some half-hour comedies that have sold and gotten set up that were upwards to 40 pages long. A lot of times those writers are going to be the showrunner, or they're well-known writers, and so they can kind of get away with that. As writers who have yet to have something produced and you're still trying to make a name for yourself, I'd keep it in that 34 pages or less range for a half-hour comedy that won't be network. For network, you're keeping it under 30. Okay, Dylan says he missed the first 10 minutes. Could you recap whose structure this is? It's mine. Seems different than what I'm used to, and I thought I heard them all. It's really the same approach of hero's journey. A lot of consultants do 8 sequences, 10 sequences. I approach it with 12. Some people do 14. Some people say there are like 7 acts in a feature. All I'm doing is trying to organize it in a way with that we can brainstorm from this level. We can develop from this level. I know the purpose of sequence 1. I know the purpose of sequence 2. You're getting into structure after you've done all the character work, that you've done the free form writing and brainstorming and development of who this person is. What are their flaws, their beliefs? What are windows into who this character is, meaning non-verbal or even non-active moments that could happen on screen where we see who this character is, the type of clock they have on their bedside table, the clothes they wear, the car they drive. Those are when you're going to be doing all that character work. And in TV, you're going to be doing it for all the primary characters, and really even in features. But yeah, this is mine. Could you recap whose structure this is? It's mine. Jamie, I'm writing a script for a film, but my subject matter is so big, so many stories that could be told. It could be easily a series, which I would really like it to be. It's an inspired by true story. So when you pitch it, do you bring it up that you or me considered it to be a series, or wait for a response? I think you got to make the decision up front, Jamie. This type of show where you're seeing multiple storylines, it's inspired by a true story, that you could go much longer than an hour and a half, 2-hour movie. It's probably smarter to develop it as a TV series. If in a pitch meeting you note, I have ways that it could be a feature, that's great. As many mediums or sources that you can create based on whatever the IP is, awesome. Since this is inspired by a true story, I will say a lot of the mandates that our production company has received by some of the major studios and streamers, virtually all of them want IP, basically source material that's based on something, either an existing book, an existing true story, an article from a newspaper, or whatever, ripped from the headlines idea, that can then exist in multiple fashions, mediums. It can be a feature, it could be a TV series, it could be merchandise, it could be a fiction podcast, and I think there are 2 or 3 other things, games, they're looking for projects that can hit multiple areas and markets, as opposed to only exist as a movie or even only exist as a TV series. Of course, companies are still looking for projects that can exist in only that way. But if you have something that you can branch off, a fiction podcast, if it could exist in that way, I suggest everybody who's writing a TV series that's in some form of like a thriller, horror, true crime, fantasy, maybe science fiction type of genre, consider what it would feel like if you wrote it as a fiction podcast. It's basically a script without visuals. So you want to be thinking, how would I deliver the story without people seeing anything? It's only sound. And so it's actually a really fun exercise, even if it doesn't exist as one. You can maybe see a different angle, and listen to fiction podcasts. There is one that I listened to. It's called Life After. I think it's the GE podcast network. It's called Life After. I don't think there's a space between life and after. It's incredible. I couldn't believe how engaged I was by this 22-minute episode of basically a radio play, but it was very acted out. The sound design was incredible. The actors were really good. Look into it. Just think about it. Yeah, like Dylan's saying, in a way, it can be a verbal novel, but there are some that could be kind of like a highly produced audiobook. I've heard some of those. There was one, gosh, I can't remember the name of it. The Leviathan Chronicles, I think it's called, which is you hear a narrator reading a book, but then you hear sound effects, etc. But then when there is dialogue, you have actors come in and they're playing the scene out. So it's kind of like a kind of combination. It's engaging and fun, but it sounds like an audiobook. Those totally exist and it's totally fine, but it's highly produced. And then the fiction podcasts like Homecoming is very famous. The TV series with Julia Roberts was based on that fiction podcast. Listen to some of them. They're really engaging, and podcasts are still huge. What is the course that you mentioned? Valika asks. So it's called The Craft Course, and it's just The Craft Course. Oops. .com. It's $100. It's a 12-week course, self-guided, but I have a ton of video and audio on there, and you can, once you buy it, you have it forever. You can go through it multiple times. And a lot of what I talked about today, I go into much greater detail in there. Can the final image end with the protagonist if you opened with the antagonist? Is this ideal? I don't know if there's anything ideal. Let's try not to, and I know you're not necessarily saying this, Alvi, but there's no real cookie cutter approach. There's no, like I said, there's no paint by numbers. And again, I know that's not necessarily what you're asking, but can the final image end with the protagonist if you open with the antagonist? Of course. And I don't mean to talk that down, but you have to look at what's the reason why. Why am I doing that from a meaningful, emotional place? What does it represent metaphorically? Beginning images and end images are very important to consider, because you're telling the audience something without telling them. That's a little bit of subtext, but a lot can be experienced by just seeing something. So I think it's a good place to be, Alvi, in terms of what is my opening image, what is my final image. To basically answer your question, absolutely. I wouldn't say necessarily it's ideal, just because it's completely relative to your story. If you feel like it could work that way and be emotional and powerful and have an impact, great. Yeah, do it. Can you touch briefly on your thoughts around the first 9 acts in a feature? So I think what you mean is 9 sequences. You could call them acts, I guess, but basically each sequence in a feature is roughly 10 pages long. Again, that is not perfect. If you had 10 pages for every each sequence, which I teach 12, that'd be a 120-page script. Please don't write a 120-page script. Not every sequence is created equal in terms of length, but sequences 1, 2, and 3. So you've got, it's all, I could go into a much longer lecture here, and I've done that before. But sequences 1, 2, and 3 make your first act, right? You've got a main character stage of life. Where are they in their life when we meet them? Were they just fired? Are they about to get married? Is their 16th birthday, coming up the next week? They're on the verge of something, or something just happened. There's a stage of life, but that's used so you can show flaw, belief system, how they react to the world around them, friends that they exist with, the world that they're in, the arena. Is it 1963 Chicago suburbs? Is it the moon? What Lord of the Rings? What's the world? It's that kind of idea. Sequence 2 is the setup event. A lot of you call it the inciting incident, basically the same thing. But you're setting up this opportunity for the character to pursue something. Then the third sequence is the secondary character really showing who that person is going to be in the life of the main character. It's kind of when, like, Doc Brown really presents his impact on Marty in Back to the Future. Even though Marty goes to the new world, as Joseph Campbell calls it, that can sometimes define the beginning of the second act. I like to look at it as how we kind of stretch it out a little bit, and really the first act ends when Doc points to the camera and says, "We're going to get you back to the future." And then Marty's like, "Great, I can hang out in 1955 for a while," and blah, 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 blah. That's really when the second act starts. Sequences 4, 5, and 6. First half of your second act, it's pretty straightforward. It's the character experiencing the new world, tests and trials. They're forming a relationship with somebody. It's kind of working out. The opponent is attempting in, their pursuit, little victories along the way, but not big ones. The main character in the secondary, or the team that they're with, in their pursuit, they're actually achieving things. They're finding small victories little by little. But we're seeing a lot about who this person is from how they relate to the secondary, or whoever the third character might be in the story. You're going to have multiple characters, I'm sure. The sixth sequence is that major complication. It's the plot twist. But remember that plot twists because it affects the main character. In a lot of ways, you could look at the end of an episode of TV like a repeat of your midpoint complication that you hear, so often in structure worlds and in features. You have just another major complication. We're not resolving the story. It's a new complication. Sequences 7 and 8 is kind of the fallout from that complication. The main character is usually pushing harder and harder. Cracks in relationships start to show. The opponent is winning. The pursuit that the main character is on is still moving forward, but the main character is falling into his or her own flaw a little bit more because they're getting a little desperate. They're really trying to make sure that their plot goal is achieved, but we're seeing if you were to squeeze someone, what kind of emotions come out, that kind of idea. The sequence 9 then is your low point, where the main character has kind of this attempt to resolve or achieve this plot, and they fail. And it's usually the main character's fault. Try to keep an active main character in your 9th sequence, as opposed to like a low point just happening to them. So it's not as engaging. I could go into that a lot more, Jill, but hopefully that quick review was helpful. Okay, Simone, if I would like to write a script based on a novel or something like that, what would be the legal implications? Do I need to get permission in some way first before I even start drafting? So technically speaking, you do not need to get, see, this is tricky, everybody. I'm not an attorney. Take my advice here with a grain of salt, but technically speaking, you do not need permission to just write the script. You could rewrite Finding Nemo, whatever. Once you start trying to sell the thing, that's when obviously the legal implications come along, because you don't have the right to sell that remake of a movie, or you don't necessarily have the life rights to someone that you're writing about. Some stories, if it's like there are some caveats with public figures, things like that, things that are in the public domain, you'd want to check to see if it's in the public domain. Even if you change the character names, there are some things that could come back to haunt you because the situation itself is legally bound. Again, I'm not a copyright attorney. I'm not even an attorney. So it's tricky. So the safest bet would be to try to find the person that it's based on and just, see if you can get in touch. I know it's a lot easier said than done. Do some Google searches on that one, Chris, because that's a bigger question that I really can't give all the right answers to. Let's see here. Jamie, do series of shots and a montage both have a beginning, middle, and end? Series of shots, yeah, a little bit. I mean, a montage, they're both basically the same thing. Series of shots, sometimes series of shots is just boom, 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 and there isn't like a story you're telling. A montage usually has a little bit more of a beginning, middle, and end. How different is this from Soth's mini movies approach? I don't know who Soth is, but I think, Chris Soth. Yeah, I got it. I think it's Chris Soth. It's somewhat similar. Chris, I think, goes by an 8. And I think he calls them sequences, but it's relatively similar. I don't know Chris's teachings perfectly though, so it's hard for me to, say exactly what it is. But Chris is great. He's really good at brainstorming ideas and kind of taking nothing from, or something from nothing. Sarah, what would you say is acceptable page length for a feature length script? Is 70 to 75 enough? 70 to 75 is not enough. I hate to be so blunt. But that, if I saw that, I would see that and go, oh, so it's not done. You're looking at, the shortest amount, your 85 to 90 is probably that range. You're like, a comfortable page count is 100 pages, 105. If you keep it under 110, that's a nice, comfortable page limit. But again, it's totally relative to your project. There are a lot of romantic comedies that are less than 100. Some horror movies are less than 90, even like A Quiet Place, I think, was in the upper 70s or low 80s, but it's because there's no dialogue. So it's kind of relative, but I would say 70 to 75 is probably not long enough. You're going to want to develop some more. What's the most saleable budget range for a feature these days? 200 million. I hate to be straightforward, but it's the truth. The more expensive the project is, if you can get it to the right people who have the money, studios are looking, they can spend more money on, they can make more money if they spend more money. However, what they're spending more money on is proven product. That's the rub, Joseph, sorry to say. If you don't have Harry Potter, I would say, and I'm being a little bit of a smartass with that answer, Joseph, but I would say don't worry about making sure it fits in a sellable range. Write the story that means the most to you, and then see what you think it might cost. If you have a movie in the $1 to $5 million range, that's great, as long as the hook is marketable or is written really well. I will say, I think Netflix looks at low budget movies. Low budget for them is like less than 30. That might be outdated information. And so it all depends. So again, try to pay attention a little bit in terms of how expensive your project is going to be. The more explosions you have, the more locations you have, the more characters you have. If you have huge crowd scenes, major special effects, that's all going to raise the level of your budget quite a bit. But I would say the budget ranges of like 70 to 80 or like 65 to 90, kind of tricky. You're kind of in somewhat murky waters, because people are like, well, it's not 100 million plus. Would we spend 100 million on a movie like this? But then it's also kind of like, it's not quite high budget or low budget. It's just, so I would try to think less than 30 for, again, it's hard to say, everybody, because where you are in your career means a lot. What you've done and what your experience is means a lot. If you're a writer that's unproduced, just write the script that you love. If it's a $200 million movie and it's not based on any IP, then write it. Like, just write the script. Like, somebody's going to eventually read this and give you notes and advice. And maybe that's a project that you come back to 5, 6, 7 years, from now, and maybe it gets you writing assignments or something. I think the important thing to remember for everybody listening, please believe me when I say this, I'm being as optimistic and helpful as I can. I would say 90% or more of working screenwriters, people who are in the WGA making money, make their money through writing assignments or rewrites, or they are asked to then write a script and they sell the script, but they're not kept on as a producer, or it's not their movie necessarily. They write a script and they pass it on and they get a nice little payday. It's rare that you just outright sell a spec for a lot of money. It doesn't really happen that much anymore. So the more scripts you have in your arsenal, more options and opportunities that you create for yourself. So yes, it's important to pay attention to budget, but I wouldn't write a script just because this is the marketable or saleable area of a budget range. So a lot of caveats in there. How do writers work directly with you? So you can email me, max@thestoryfarm.org, or you can go to thestoryfarm.org, and I have call packages. So you can purchase 4 or 8 or 12. I think I have a 20 call package as well. I might have removed that from the site. And those calls are used for virtually anything. They could be full reads and evaluations. It's literally a call. I record it and I send you the recording and I send you written notes. Or if you want to have 8 or 12 calls or maybe even more, we can develop a project together. So I'm looking at a 1-page up front or a log line, or we brainstorm here all the projects that I have. I've got 12 log lines. Let's read them all. Let's go through them. Let's choose the one that we think you're the most excited to work on. And the one I think might be, a little bit further along in terms of conceptualization. Let's start working on that. And then we start from the beginning. It's character development. It's looking at the concept itself. How do we draw out this hook as much as we can? And so we're developing it little by little every call. And every call is anywhere from 20 minutes to an hour and a half. It really depends on how much material there is to read and go over. So you can email me if you have some more questions. Tony, if one of the characters is based on a real person, not famous, but that person is dead, do I need to get permission from family? It's possible. I think that's my best answer. I don't know all the legal issues there. So it's difficult for me to say absolutely or no. So I would probably lean toward likely. I would lean toward likely. I don't want to give too many more answers to that. But so Kai, can you legally write about, we got a lot of legal questions here, everybody. Can you legally write about someone who's real but fictionalize them? It's based on a real person I admire that has since passed. I'd like to use his real name. If you start using real names, then it's tricky because that person likely has an estate, especially if they're even semi-famous. If this is your neighbor or someone in town, and you completely if you use their name, I think the name kind of is gonna kind of cling to something there. What is the purpose of an action line and one that is not an introduction of a character? The purpose of an action line, I call it scene direction. Sometimes call it an action line. Final Draft kind of forced the community to call it an action line because that's what they have you select when you go into an action line setting. It's fine, but basically the purpose is to present visual, because we have to remember that what we're writing is a visual representation of the story that you want to tell. That's difficult because we don't want to tell things. We don't want to just have exposition throughout an entire screenplay. We want the visuals to tell us things so that the audience can participate in not only what we're seeing, but in the story as it goes. So if anybody can find the Quiet Place script online, read A Quiet Place. Don't do exactly what those writers did, because what they did in that script was really kind of insane. They wrote like one word on one page sometimes. But it's very simple that in terms of the scene direction and action lines, that here's the visual, here's what we're seeing. And in a way, that action line also kind of represents various edits and cuts. So if you have a new line down, if you have one action line, it's 2 sentences, and then you go another line down, in a way, a director could look at that and go, okay, we're going to have this angle for this scene direction line, and then we're going to have this angle for this next one, and so on and so forth. So it's to make sure the reader is following along from an information standpoint based on what we're seeing. The dialogue then is to enhance or comment on those visuals. That's a really general definition of dialogue. Dialogue does a lot more than that, but we don't want to rely on the dialogue to tell us the story. And we don't only need to rely on the visuals to tell us the story, but try to lean a little bit more toward the visualization of everything. So yeah, the sequel, I'm just looking at Jill's comment. I love The Quiet Place. Wasn't impressed with the sequel. I think because, and this is just my opinion, it's because the concept was so great in the first one that we already knew what the concept was in the second one. We knew what the monsters were. So there wasn't really that surprise so much anymore. And then we get into kind of that effect of, well, we've already seen the danger. Now we're going to see a continuation of the same danger. So that was a tricky one to have a sequel for. I thought it was still really well done. But anyway, Andrew's saying they don't write what can't be filmed, but I've read many scripts describing what characters are thinking. So that's a whole other topic that I don't have too much time to go into, but it's a good comment and point to make, Andrew, because it is okay for a writer every now and then to have little quips in the scene direction. I remember reading in a script once, and I'll try to set the scene so you understand the scene itself. But to make a very long story short, there was a young couple that I think it was even a short film. No, it wasn't. Anyway, there's a young couple, and the conceptual approach to this kind of comedy with romance, I hesitate to say romantic comedy, it's more of a comedy, but this young couple is concerned with their relationship and how it might be coming to an end. And so they do what they can to fix it. And the do what they can is to, once a week, one of the two in the partnership says, this is what we're going to do. And the other person has to do it. It could be anything. And so they're like, okay, they agree. And so they start small. And the girlfriend wants to take surfing lessons. The guy is not in any way athletic. He doesn't want to do this at all. So he's begrudgingly going to the beach. And so they take these surfing lessons, and the instructor is like He-Man, like he's this gorgeous man. And of course the boyfriend is immediately jealous, and there's this, back and forth. So the girlfriend tries to run to the water with her oversized surfboard, and she falls. She kind of nosedives into the sand. The boyfriend goes over to help. And I know this is a long setup, but this is in relation to what Andrew was saying. The boyfriend goes over, kneels down, and the girlfriend picks her head up. She's got sand everywhere, and she looks up, and you get this visual written in the script of the instructor coming over, and his head kind of moves in front of the sun, so it looks like he's haloed. And the scene direction is kind of written through the perspective of the boyfriend. And so the scene direction says she, lifts her head up and she looks at his perfect fucking everything. And it was enough for me to be like, I get what that visual is. There was a reference to the halo, of course, but that's what I mean by just slight commentary. We're not going into what the main character necessarily is thinking from like a novelistic approach. But she looks up at his perfect fucking everything, and it's funny and so it sets tone as well. So it's okay to do it every now and then. Don't overdo it, especially when you go into this idea of here's what the character is thinking in the moment, because we can't see that. And so it's a lot like what Andrew was saying. But it does help with tone. So you want to balance that out as much as you can. Anything done in excess in a script people are going to be annoyed by it. Parentheticals, transitions. It's okay to use parentheticals and transitions. Just don't overuse them, because then it becomes like this ridiculous, like, what am I reading? Hopefully I didn't drone on and on and on too much. I did see one person comment with Z's. That made me feel good. Thank you for that comment. I will do what I can to make this as exciting as I possibly can going forward. But hopefully you all learned a little bit of something. Don't forget about the upcoming events with the ISA. Check the events page. And this has been recorded. You'll be able to rewatch it. It probably won't be available for another week or so, but just stay tuned. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, because this also will exist there. And we have a whole bunch of other videos. So you can search for International Screenwriters Association on YouTube. All right, everybody, that's it. I will see you next month. And until then, keep working hard. Bye.